All right, so to introduce our speakers, I am really excited to bring you our keynote speaker. Up first is Jevan Soo Lenox. As the Chief People and Culture Officer at Stitch Fix, Jevan was responsible for employee-related initiatives that ensured the company found, grew, and retained the brightest, kindest, and most motivated talent in the world. Previously, Jevan held key people operations and business leadership roles at high-growth, consumer-centric companies, including Minted, Blue Bottle Coffee, and Square. Jevan began his career at McKinsey & Company, where he spent nearly a decade in both consulting and recruiting leadership roles in North America and Asia Pacific. Jevan received an AB in East Asian Studies from Harvard College, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and a Master's in Public Policy from Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome, Jevan. He's going to be in conversation with Deanna Stinson-Rees, who, as the CEO and founder of E3 Professional Services, Deanna used her 10 plus years of combined experience in human resources, learning, and development to transform and propel the success trajectory for seasoned professionals in their career journey, as well as helping organizations improve performance and retention, especially with their diverse teams. She began consulting professionals about 10 years ago, and Deanna takes a special interest in working with women to help move them into senior level VP or C-suite roles. As we all know, there is a huge disparity in women, especially minority women, presence in these levels of leadership, and she works to help combat that. She also partners with businesses to provide results-driven corporate trainings. Outside of work, Deanna dedicates time to supporting teen moms and single mothers struggling to stay afloat in the Houston and Chicagoland area. Deanna believes that mindset change activates behavioral change. So welcome to both of you. I'm really excited to turn the floor over to you and listen in on this amazing keynote. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Meg. Such an awesome introduction. And thank you, Jevan, for being here today with us. I'm so excited to jump right in. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Good, awesome. So let's jump right in because time is going to fly. So I want us to start by allowing you some space to really tell us a little bit more about yourself, where you're based, any fun facts about yourself, if you picked up a pandemic hobby, things of that sort. Let the audience know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, I live in San Francisco. Oh, are you getting a little bit of an echo? You okay?
No, I'm good. Me. I'll let you know if it comes up though.
Perfect. I live in San Francisco with my husband, 2 kids, a 3-year-old and a 9-month-old. The 9-month-old just went upstairs to nap, so hopefully I think we're good. And we have a 60-pound Airedale Terrier who is basically like another person in the house. So we're happily ensconced here in the Mission neighborhood of San Francisco, and we have this very sort of fun, you can kind of see it in the blurred background a little bit, but we have this little kind of courtyard with 2 homes. And actually the other home is owned by a lesbian couple who I went to business school with. And so we all bought it as this very kind of modern family, communal, redefinition of what it means to be neighbors and friends. And, their daughter grew up, there for a few years. And we actually took their nanny when they moved back to Singapore. So we have this very kind of fun communal life here. In terms of hobbies, pandemic hobbies, this is not a new hobby, but I love to bake. So this is, I think, something that a lot of other people sort of leaned into during the pandemic, but that is not super great for fitness and health. So the new pandemic hobby is running. So actually, I've run 2 half marathons during the pandemic, and now I'm actually training for a 3rd.
Awesome. Fun fact, I used to run track. If you ask me to go run now, not happening. But the fact that you're running marathons, I am so
Deanna,
jealous.
It can happen. I quit high school cross country, and here I am, decades later, I'm back. So you can do it.
There we go. Awesome. You also had a recent career transition. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I just finished up with Stitch Fix actually about a week ago after over 3 years. It was an amazing run. It's an amazing company. I'm sure we'll talk a bunch about it during this hour together. But I also am a big believer of, I think, and actually our CEO founder, Katrina, talks about this a lot, of every year sort of reflecting and saying, what's the year ahead? What does this company need from me? What do I need from, the role, the team, and so on, and just how do those sort of things go together? And then obviously thinking about your family and all the other things in your life. And as I was sort of launching into this fourth year, on one hand, I was so excited about everything that was ahead of the company, but also I think just like many folks through this pandemic and through, just honestly a very, very challenging year and a half in terms of racial equity and injustice in this country, just sort of said, what, I think I need to take a break, which is hard because I love this company, I love my team, and there's still a lot of great work to do, but I sort of owe it to them to sort of have that honest reflection of like, do I have a full tank of gas?
Yes. The fact that you mentioned just being able to take that pause and reflect is super important, because a lot of times we forget to do that. And the work that we do, that many folks do, can be taxing. And so, like you said, making sure you have that full tank of gas is super duper important. What first actually attracted you to the company? I know until recently you served as Chief People and Culture Officer at Stitch Fix, but I want us to take a step back and kind of look at what attracted you to come to the company, especially from a people and culture perspective.
Yeah, I got to know the company a few years back, and I was at Minted, was not looking, and did the whole let's have an introductory conversation, what can it hurt kind of thing. And I went into the office and I saw a sort of decal on the wall of the interview room. And Stitch Fix has a cultural set of values that we call the OS, our operating system. And so I saw the OS for the first time on this interview room wall. And my teams and colleagues say that I am a fairly snarky person who kind of is an optimist. So I'm snarky optimist is what they call me. And so my immediate sort of reaction of seeing this beautiful culture decal on the wall was cool. Lots of companies have very pretty pictures on the wall. Lots of companies have pretty words on a wall. We'll see if it means anything. And what happened was I had a lot of interviews because it was, for a senior leadership role. And on both sides, I think you just want to take the time to really make sure that's the right fit. And as I got to know more people, and I was speaking with, leaders, the VP level, the C-suite level, even a board member, the first thing that I noticed that was really interesting was that the OS and elements of the OS kept coming up in conversation. And even then, snarky optimist, first kind of couple of times I sort of said, oh, well, this is a plan, right? Like they're interviewing me for a people and culture job. Of course, they're going to talk about the culture. And it just kept happening. And to some point, I was like, this can't be manufactured, right? It'd just be too awkward for them, right? It keeps coming up in conversation really organically, in them talking about the work and talking about what's important and what's challenging. So that I thought made me really start to believe, this is a company that takes it seriously. This is a company that really wants to do it right. The second thing that I thought was really powerful was as I got to know these leaders, I really saw elements of the OS in them. And again, not because they were sort of saying, I, embody this value, right? But just as they talked about the stories of the work that they had done, even time before Stitch Fix, the things that they were wrestling with, the ways that they had grown as leaders in the company, it really brought the values to life. And again, I sort of said that's actually what you are really striving for in this work. And to some extent, I would say, while I wish it was table stakes, at a lot of companies, it's just not the case. And so, it's an amazing company from a business perspective as well. It's so innovative, has done incredible things in the world of retail and so on. So, I was really excited about those things as well, but very specifically around people and culture, that's what caught my eye.
That's very interesting. First of all, I love snarky optimists. Okay, so I'm going to kind of borrow that if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it. Join the club.
Okay. But I think that that's really awesome to hear. And I want to lean in a little bit more because when you mentioned that how their values were kind of embedded as or translated as their operating system, I wanted you to talk a little bit about values driven versus, a culture driven mindset, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I saw this question and I loved it. I think it's a really interesting question. I actually don't think that they're in opposition, but I do think the question is an important one. I think it comes from the fact that for too long, companies and kind of even news headlines and so on, right? they talked about culture in a way that wasn't value centric. They talked about what your offices look like, or what the coolest perk is that you offer, or like what's on the menu at lunch in your fancy cafeteria, whatever, right? Like how many offsites do you have? Like what, it's all these sort of like activities and trappings of an organization that I think, it's not that I don't think they can't embody culture, but I don't think that those things are culture. I think actually culture is about values, right? It's about what are the things that you stand for, and even more importantly, not just sort of what you say you stand for, but when push comes to shove, what really carries the day in terms of the hard decisions that you make as an organization. One of the things I talk a lot about in culture is it's the way that people treat each other when the doors are closed, right? It's not, and all, again, the way that you act in front of a big company, all hands in front of lots of ways, obviously still matters, right? That your culture comes through there too, but it's really around a really tough meeting between three people. What gets said? How do you resolve that challenge? After the meeting, does someone give feedback to the other person on how that meeting went? How do they do that? Is that other person open to the feedback, right? Those are the things for me that that's actually what really culture is about. And that's actually really about values, what you believe and how they come to life. But I do think the two have gotten disaggregated in a way that I think isn't very helpful, but I'm glad actually I think they're starting to come together.
Yes, I love it. Values, I like to think that values is what informs and what is the premises of culture, right? That's what's going to shape it and determine what it looks like. So I love how you broke that down. That was great. Let's actually, I want to stay on values a little bit more. So let's think about when you were working with a global team like you did, how did you ensure that your team or the entire team was working towards the same mission and the same set of values, or embodying those same set of values?
Thinking through some battle scars on this one. It's some of the work I love doing most, but it's not easy. So I'll go back in time a little bit to talk about a couple other organizations that I led at where we wrestled with this challenge. The way I often think about it is you want to have a universal set of cultural values, a universal set of ways that people think about being at an organization together, working together, striving towards great work together, that is really consistent. Right? You have to have this great kind of foundation. I think it's really hard when people talk about, well, it's this company, in name, but really, if you go to this business unit or if you go to this country market, it's totally different, right? You get people sort of talking about haves and have-nots. If you really want to have a great organization where people move around in different roles and teams, as I've gotten to do in my career and felt really lucky to do so, it's really hard to do that if people are really worried about, well, gosh, Deanna loves her experience, over here in the Boston office, and now she's thinking about going to, I want to pick a city and make it feel like it's a bad city, but maybe she hears that the Copenhagen office is even better than Boston office, and she's kind of bummed out. Why is that? Why is that the case? I lived in Boston for 10 years. And so you really want to have that universal experience. But then I think to say that there is no difference at all is foolish. Like they're going to be local flavors of that, right? Citrus, we have a saying, we say things that are spicy. So to be spicy, it's when someone says to me, I don't see race. Okay, are we still doing that? like the whole point is that you actually have to see race, but you do it in a way that is thoughtful, that accounts for, not going on my soapbox, but accounts for all the historical inequities and the ones that still exist that we have to sort of challenge ourselves to do. But it's not actually to pretend that nothing's there, right? And so similarly, to make it real, two examples. So McKinsey, when I was there, we were in, I think 50 or 60 countries around the world, sort of well-established blue chip management consulting firm. And we had this pretty strong sort of central culture, but we were in all these really different countries. And some of those countries had really different cultures, frankly, national cultures than the US and Western Europe, which is where McKinsey started. And so sometimes I would say that created some pretty hard challenges. And so when I moved to Shanghai to lead Asia Pacific recruiting for McKinsey, and I was working with a lot of Chinese consultants. One of the things McKinsey talks a lot about is a value that we call obligation to dissent. So this idea that if you have a perspective that you think is different than what's being shared in the room, it doesn't matter if everyone there is more senior than you, if the most senior partner is pounding the table for a different perspective. If you really believe that there's something there that needs to be discussed, or that someone's missing something, you have an obligation to dissent, right? It's not even just you're empowered to do so, like you're obligated to do so. That's the right thing to do for the team. It's the right thing to do for the client. Sounds awesome. Not, of course, to learn how to do it, it's not easy and so on, but it's, as a 22-year-old fresh sort of college grad, it's a very empowering thing to sort of experience. You talk to sort of Chinese new college grads and they look at you and they're like, are you crazy? I would never do that to a more senior colleague. And I'm a Chinese American, so I actually sort of felt both sides of this a little bit, right? Like growing up in a traditional Chinese family, you would not disagree with an elder in the family. And so how do you sort of make these two things go together? And of course you can't just sort of tell, we had almost 1,000 Chinese colleagues, right? Well, ignore your national culture, ignore your family culture, right? The obligation to dissent is the McKinsey thing. But to say to them, hey, I know that you have a strong sort of cultural inclination to not speak up in those situations and to not disagree, and that's fine, don't ever dissent, is also problematic, right? And so it's actually quite tricky to sort of talk about it. And the way that I think we ultimately sort of work through it is to just be really open about it. These are two things that you're experiencing. By the way, many of those Chinese colleagues came to McKinsey because they wanted a global experience, right? If they wanted a more hierarchical sort of culture, they would go to a Chinese state-owned enterprise. They would go to a different organization. And so, my sort of belief, if you're thinking about this sort of global culture and the sensitivity that you need to navigate these different local contexts, is just to really be open about it. To say, here's what we're striving for in terms of a sort of global consistency that we stand for as an organization. And here are the things that feel specific to this local context that might be a different flavor, or even frankly, be slightly in opposition. And how do we sort of talk about that? Another, such a spicy thing we talked about that I experienced there was when I went to McKinsey China out of over almost 1,000 colleagues, there was only one other out LGBTQ plus individual in the entire region. And when I went to talk to him about it, he told me not to come out. And I had been out for 5 years at this point in my career in McKinsey North America. I had been recruited openly out on college campus and so on. And so this was, kind of opposite days. So like, wait, we're at the same company. And they said, look, it's not a supportive culture here on this dimension, which reflects the national kind of climate. And this was something that I talked with a number of other colleagues in developing countries in Latin America and Africa and so on, who said they had experienced very similar things, even though McKinsey as an umbrella organization was amazing, like really, really supportive. And so it's interesting, like I went back and I essentially kind of went back in the closet a little bit for the first time in my career in several years. But basically just sort of made choices around, like, I would never lie. So someone asked me point blank, like, do you have a partner or so on? Like, I would always be truthful. But I was certainly approached it a little bit differently than I did in Boston and New York. But I sort of said, like, I want to be open. I want to take a stand, but I do just have to figure out how to do that personally that's right for me. And I think just still honestly reflective of where we are at this moment in time in this sort of local society. And the great sort of optimistic ending to this is a number of other people came out during my time there as a sort of, frankly, saw the American guy come over with his boyfriend, later husband, and so people started, I think, finding more confidence themselves as, of course, China continues to open up, although it's not, still has its own challenges.
I forgot for a brief moment that I was muted to try to minimize any echoing, but wow, such powerful stories. And the fact that you had at one point in your career, you felt like even though you had already kind of been living in your truth and you were open about your truth, that you had to kind of bottle that back in, for the sake of your career at some point in time, and how as a wider organization, it's like on the outside, or, from a large scale view or bird's eye view, things look oh so great and so nice. But when you start getting into the different intricacies, the culture just looks different. That's really good to hear. And I hope the audience is really letting this digest, because as you go through your career, just you being individuals in general, it's super duper important to understand those various facets and intricacies, words are trying to escape me today, of understanding a company's culture. Is very multifaceted. It's not just, a blank slate or something that's, just for face value. So I'm so glad you were able to dive a little bit deeper into those areas. And since we kind of got to talking about culture and kind of the evolution of how companies evolve with their own like DEI work that they're doing internally, I do want to look at Stitch Fix's approach to social impact, specifically looking at sustainability and equity. I want us to talk a little bit about, or you tell us a little bit more about Stitch Fix's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I would say with Stitch Fix, we have a long kind of heritage and commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and it really, as these things should sort of start with the top. So Katrina is actually quite, I think, sort of admired and well known in the tech and retail industry for having assembled a really diverse board, a really diverse executive team over time, and this is all, you can actually go on our social impact website and find our diversity statistics and so on. And to be clear, we still have work to do, so it's not that we've done everything, but in many places, and particularly around these sort of leadership levels, and then also in our technical organizations, our gender representation, both for our sort of individual engineers and data scientists and other technical roles, as well as in leadership positions, is historically has been sort of around 30%, probably even a little bit higher. And while it's still short of 50-50, which I think is the sort of long-term aspiration, those of you who know the statistics for gender representation in tech, that kind of blows away the field. And so I think there's been a commitment from the beginning that Katrina has really led from the front on. And that's not to say I think there hasn't been a recognition that this work was really never done, right? So it's really just recognizing like, okay, well, what is this next chapter, and what are the things for us? And so for us, BIPOC representation, particularly in our technical roles, continues to be something that we're very attuned to and leaning in on. And I would say one of the things that we have been really focused on in this past kind of year and a half is really around community. And so one of the things that we recently did was launched what many other organizations call ERGs. We are quite determined not to call them ERGs, actually, because it's fine if you call them ERGs, but just for me, it's like it's another acronym. Like I just kind of, we have an amazing diversity, equity, and inclusion leader, Dre Triadi. She and I talked a lot about the small choices that you make around language like really matter, and so how do we just sort of do things that feel more human, more sort of evocative of what we're trying to achieve together. And so we decided to call them communities, because that's what they are, right? Communities of people with shared experience and shared challenge. But the thing that we did, so to create these, I think in of itself is not groundbreaking, to be clear, right? But I would say that we really tried to learn from what we felt were some of the mistakes or learnings of other organizations in how we went about this. And so the first thing that we did was really thinking about the charter. And so we chose a number of communities and really sort of created a mission and statement and a charter for them that said, this is really around centering on the experience of the most marginalized communities, particularly in the context of business, right? And sort of the business that we do, right, in terms of retail and tech and so on, and just be super upfront about that. Right? And so these communities exist. They can, I think, fulfill a number of purposes, but first and foremost, they are centering on sort of the lived experience and the voices of these marginalized people within our sort of company, and helping them, I think, sort of make a company better, both in terms of, sort of for their own experience and for other employees, but also for our clients, right? And then actually really kind of creating an organizational structure around that, that really ensured that we spoke to all of our employees. And so one fun fact that people often don't realize about Stitch Fix is that, of our many, many thousands of employees, almost 90% of them are hourly. So we have a lot of data scientists, we have amazing engineers and marketers, and everyone you could think of in terms of like a really disruptive e-commerce retail company. But we also have thousands of part-time stylists who work with our clients and help them find amazing things. We have thousands of warehouse associates. Not a secret that many of us have. I think would not have gotten through the pandemic, we're not through the frontline workers in warehouses in many companies across the world. And of course, we have several hundred customer support agents that we call client experience. And so the bulk of our organization is actually hourly. And when I was really sort of starting to shape the strategy for our next chapter of diversity, equity, inclusion work, and actually going to higher directory and interviewing candidates, this was one of my key questions. I said, I still have not heard of any organizations that I think are really serving hourly employees on DEI in a really compelling way. And we have from the start, again, sort of hats off to Katrina, we have from the start created a company where we did not have second-class citizens. Really small, but for me has always been a really powerful example of this. So you said, when did you sort of start falling in love with Stitch Fix as a company? In one of my final interviews, they brought me to a warehouse so I could sort of walk the floor and meet the team members and just sort of see how technology and sort of human workers sort of combine. And I'd spent a lot of time at the headquarters office at that point. And so as I was walking around the warehouse and meeting people and so on, I looked over to the snack kitchen area and I saw that they had the exact same snacks as headquarters. Small, but not small. I can tell you many other companies that have that kind of employee population sort of breakdown, they do not have the exact same snacks in the warehouse. And so this is it's kind of small but vivid example for me of sort of like, okay, this is like what we've set out to do as a culture. And so we've already given up the game if we create communities or ERGs or so on, and we kind of ignore the hourly population, because to be real, it's harder, right? They're much more distributed. They have set schedules. They're paid on an hourly basis, right? Like there's just a lot more sort of contextual constraints relative to sort of headquarters workers, if you will, which most sort of other companies have focused on. But we created a structure where that was basically first and foremost something that we had to sort of solve for. And we actually just announced internally our community leaders, and every one of the communities is co-led by a leader from kind of, if you will, a headquarters function and from one of those three sort of majority hourly functions. And so it's just something that we've really put at the center. So that's been a really big push. I would say the other big push that we've done around is around pay equity. And so we shared some of our results about a summer ago, and I'm being careful because we're actually the team is about to share our latest sort of year of impact and things that we're working on so on in a month. And so I'm kind of like, they're going to kill me if I steal their thunder. So I'm like carefully checking. So more to come. Tune in. Stitch Fix social impact website. You can Google it. But we did share a bunch of this a year ago, and we have a fairly provocative approach to compensation, in which if we have interviewed you and hired you into a role, we will pay you the same as anyone in that role across the company. So there is no manager discretion on how much to pay you. There's no range of saying like, well, Deanna showed up a little bit better in the interview process than Jevan, and so I'm just going to give her like 5% bump because she seemed, I don't know, a little bit more with it than Jevan on that day. Or, but Deanna was great, but actually Cindy over here, like, I mean, just to be blunt, like she went to like my alma mater, and we really hit it off, and we talked about. I mean, this is the shit that happens. Sorry, spice sailor language for a conference. Spicy, but this is, I mean, there's research that shows this, right? I mean, these are the things that happen even with people who I think have, reasonably good intent. It's just the things that seep into the unconscious. And so we, again, credit to Katrina, what I've just sort of done is taken the next chapter of that and really continue to refine the strategy and so on. But as she said, I refuse to do that. If you are right for the job, I'm going to take the negotiation out of the equation. You should just know that you're going to get paid fairly, that anyone else doing that job in a great way at the company is going to be paid in the same way, and that you're not secretly getting paid less, which, by the way, is lots of people are finding out can be the case. And so those are two, obviously there's so many other things I could talk about, but those are two things I'd say that we've had, sort of significant mind share and time investment on, and are starting to see real fruits.
That is so awesome. Two things. Well, first, okay, for anybody that's listening and or watching simultaneously, and you are in any type of managerial role, leadership role, focused on these efforts, or even just any professionals out there, Jevan hit on two major things that a lot of companies struggle with when it comes to DEI, which is that pay equity. So like huge shout out to Stitch Fix on like being so intentional and meticulous about how y'all are like showing up in that space, but also the attention to the details. That example you use about the break room or the lunchroom area, how they had the exact same snacks, you hit the nail on the head when you said it's small, but it's not small, because it's like, exactly. It's like, it may look like something small, but it's major because it shows we don't think we're any better than the folks that are hourly or the folks that are not in the corporate office or at this location. It's even it's equity across the board in terms of something. I think food is vital because I love food. So I'm gonna say something as vital as food. Because I love food. But for those of you that are listening, I really want to make sure you guys were able to take away those key points. If you took away nothing else from this segment of the interview and from the conversation, those are two major things that companies struggle with. And those are some really good examples of how you start to really get to the core of equity, because that's what companies really struggle with. Yes, you may see diversity. Yes, folks are being included. But that equity piece is where a lot of companies miss the mark. So thank you for really highlighting that, Jevan. I want to, oh my God, I have so many things to ask you. Okay, hold on. So, because I'm like, time is ticking. I just glanced at the clock like, okay, Deanna, stay focused. So I want us to like kind of take a step back, and I want to talk a little bit. I want to give the folks that are listening a little bit of time to get some advice from you in terms of if someone is moving into a leadership role, what are some of your early or what are some of your earliest challenges or pitfalls, or what are some of the earliest challenges or pitfalls that leaders may make as individuals are moving into leadership roles?
My turn to speak on mute. I think there are two particular pitfalls that people who are moving into people leadership, well, honestly, even experienced people leaders can make. I've seen many others sort of, I think, wrestle with, and honestly, at times in my career, I probably wrestled with both. The first is feeling like leading others is key to leading others is knowing everything and being able to do everything that person's job entails better than they can. And it's interesting because I think early in your career, it is kind of true, actually, right? Like you sort of get to this next level, like you actually probably are actually just fundamentally better, able to do better, those things. And honestly, there are even cases where I would say like your first, sort of first moving to people leadership and so on, like the coaching that you're doing, depending on the type of work and so on, right? Like you might actually say like, I can actually do this faster, I can do it better and so on, right? And so really my job is actually just to make sure that they are learning that and so on, which by the way is a pitfall in of itself, because sometimes you say, it's just faster if I do it myself, which fundamentally means you're actually not making the team better, right? And I get it, sometimes you got to make that call, but I think if you're constantly making that call, it's faster if I just do it, you're going to wake up in 6 months with a whole lot of pain. But I think this idea that you need to know everything and do it better can really boomerang back at you over time. Because for me, it actually really is rooted, I think, in imposter syndrome and anxiety around well, if I don't have all the answers as a leader, if I don't know how to do it better than them, then what happens when they ask me, right, this question that I'm stumped by? And I had this really sort of pivotal moment in my own leadership journey where I had joined this company called Square, an amazing company. It was a really exciting time to be there. We were growing really, really quickly, lots of crazy stuff going on. And honestly, I just come from McKinsey, first time in tech, first time in a startup, and was totally in over my head. Super scared, like didn't really know, just like, oh gosh, this is so different and so on. And I spent that first year, I think, honestly feeling like, well, I'm supposed to know all the answers. And if my team or if other colleagues ask me questions, like I need to know all the answers. And that's actually what succeeding is. And it was a really rough year. And I actually changed teams and I moved over to lead sales operations, which is some organizations, they have big sales teams and then they have a sales operations teams. Their job is literally to make the sales team succeed. So we do all the analytics, we do set the strategy, we think about the compensation plans, we develop the trainings for them, and so it's like literally everything. Like you're on stage, we're stage crew, and I took over this team of 3 people. 2 of them had done sales operations for several years at Salesforce, so like one of the biggest sales companies in the world, and the other guy had not done sales operations but was really, really technical. Like I used to joke with him, his screen looked like the Matrix. It was just always like green code like flowing down. And so all of a sudden I was kind of like, I have no credibility whatsoever with these guys of claiming that I know how to do their jobs better, that I know all the answers, right? I'm brand new to this. Square was like kind and decided to take a chance on me to do this. I don't know. Right? And the thing was, there was a moment where I was like, I think I can either be terrified of this or I can actually feel really free. Because all of a sudden I said, like, I don't have to have all the answers. That's not what this is. And it was really the moment in my career where I learned how to lead through questions. So I said, my job isn't actually to have every single answer. My job is actually to ask great questions, to be curious, to ask, again, not just random questions, right? The questions need to move the work forward, need to sort of help them raise their game. But actually doing that from a place of not having perfect expertise sometimes is actually really powerful. And so it's just this really, really important moment for me as a leader where I think I changed my frame, and I share this advice pretty freely since then. The second piece of advice, or the second pitfall, I should say, coupled with advice, is feeling like being a people leader is about being people's friends and making them happy. Now, to be clear, I don't think that you should make everyone unhappy, but actually being a great leader means no one's always going to be happy. And this is really hard. Like there's moments where someone's going to be mad at you. Someone's going to be upset at you. You're not going to give them a promotion. You're going to give them tough feedback on the work. Whatever it is, right? And it's this interesting balance, I think, of being a great leader, of saying, of course I care. I want people to be happy, right? Of course I want them to be inspired. I want them to feel motivated and so on. And so that data, if I hear that they're not, right, it's not that you can just dismiss it. But if you just sort of center on like, are they happy and smiling today? And is, just whatever they ask for, I'm going to give it to them. You're probably actually not going to make great decisions. And so what I found over time is having this North Star around, well, what are we trying to do together as a team? And what are the principles by which I hold myself accountable as a leader, and being really transparent about that with the rest of the team, so that actually, even if they're upset about a decision you made or so on, if they respect it, they understand where it came from. It's just a very, very different dynamic. And that is something I've worked at a lot over time. I would say I'm still working on quite a bit, but was probably the second big aha I would sort of share around potential pitfalls.
Really, really, really good advice. I love that. And real challenges, being also someone, integrated into that people space. It's like, that is something that like I never even like realized or thought about, just in terms of this desire to feel like sometimes like, oh, you have to make everybody happy because like you're the person that's been designated to work on this project related to people. But it's like you said, having that North Star on, understanding those, how you're going to hold yourself accountable to certain things in terms of what you're trying to accomplish in that role. That's really good. Look, if y'all haven't been taking notes, I've been jotting down little notes. I know y'all saw my little pen moving while Jevan was talking. We got a few comments from the audience. Susanna mentioned in regards to our conversation related to communities and ERGs, she said, what you shared is so similar to what she saw at Costco and put a lot of effort into including temporary employees into their ERGs. Now, she also had a question she followed up and asked, in tech, temp employees is actually a huge issue, but there is a fundamental question, which is if the employees work full-time, are they still, I guess, considered temp, or should they still be considered temp?
Yeah, great question, Susanna. There we go. Great question, Susanna. I think there are a few questions I think kind of bundled together, so maybe I'll sort of bring them apart for clarity. The first one, I would say there's just a specific legal question in there, honestly. It's just around, hey, if they work full time, are they considered temp? Are they full-time employees and so on? And without getting super into it, there's a lot of, I would say, legal dialogue, particularly in the state of California, around what that means. And so I would say, clearly companies need to be compliant and meet their obligations and so on. So yeah, sort of putting that aside. But I think this broader question, and I think your example of what you saw at Cisco is awesome. I think it's still pretty atypical. How do you think about ERG structures and what they stand for in companies and who's allowed to participate? And I think on the temp employee question, I would say, again, a little bit tricky because there are actually some legal obligations that you have to sort of be aware of around like who can participate in what and what time and so on and so on. So I think you have to be aware of those things, but my sort of, I would say, lean is keeping that in mind. I think the more inclusive, how meta, right, that you can be, the better. While I think just respecting that, like, depending on how a tech employee's role is defined and so on, right, like you just have to sort of account for that structure. But at the end of the day, they're working at the company, they're experiencing the company, and if ERGs are, I think, constructed in a way that are ultimately to make the organization better, then there may be ways for them to participate that make sense. And maybe those ways you have to sort of define them and structure them well and so on, right? But I think if you can, doing that in close partnership with your legal team, I think that's a great thing. And I would actually extend that metaphor or that idea even further. Something that we talk a lot about at Stitch Fix is how do we actually think about our responsibility and our opportunity to bring this work to those we partner with in the world, right? So not even just sort of temporary employees or contractors or consultants or whatever it is, but actually the vendors that we work with, right? The apparel brands that we carry and so on. And I'll just give you a concrete small example of that. I don't take credit for this. The merchandising and the marketing teams over this past year in particular have just done really amazing work in thinking about what are all the ways that we create product, that we represent people in our advertising and so on, right? And what are ways that we can actually really hold ourselves accountable to sort of moving that needle forward and or moving that needle. And one of the things that is, again, small but not small. One thing that they recently did was essentially do a language audit around, well, what do we call different pieces of apparel in our systems as we sort of speaking to clients? Is there appropriation in any of that? Are there things that if we really sort of bring a new lens to it, and frankly, some of them are used very widespread in the fashion industry. But if we sort of step back and say, we speak to members of our communities and so on to say, how do we feel about this? Might we change that? And so we recently changed a number of items that have a particular construction that are similar to a Japanese kimono, and we no longer call them kimono anything because they're frankly A, they're not kimonos, and B, it just sort of felt like not sort of appropriate for us. But what I love and was so inspired by what the team did was they actually went back to these are sort of items that we carry in our selection for our clients, but they went back to the apparel makers, to those brands, and said, we wanted to let you know that we've made this change in all of our internal systems and how we talk about these items to our clients. And here's why. This is why we think the language is really important. We would strongly encourage and love for you to do the same. So it's really sort of thinking about the work as like these concentric circles of like, gosh, like you can keep sort of spreading your impact. And, I'll be sort of honest about it, right? Like it's a business, right? And so when I say, not speaking on Stitch Fix to half, I'm more for a general company, right? Like, would you say, is it right to then say, okay, if a company said like, I'm not going to change the name of the item, like you just drop them or so on, right? Like, I think those are spicier questions, if you will. But I think they're nevertheless from where a lot of companies are today to what I think they can be doing in terms of having that dialogue and using their presence in the market if they've been successful to really, I think, at least make sure the conversation is happening. Another example from Stitch Fix is when we went and did our IPO several years ago. For those of you unfamiliar with an IPO process, typical IPO process, you as a company select a couple banks that help you do this roadshow, and you pitch the company and you try to get all these investors to buy in. Hopefully the stock goes up and all this stuff. And stock market's been a little bit weird this past year, but putting that aside, that's how an IPO is supposed to work. And one of the things that the team did, this is before me, so I won't take credit for it, just praising the team. The team did before me was they asked all of the banks who were pitching for the IPO, and these IPOs make banks a lot of money, right? So they really want these gigs. They asked them to submit all of their diversity statistics as part of their pitch. And they said they're honest and like, look, this is not the number one criteria. So we're not selecting just on this, but it is a criteria. And we're also not just going to say, well, who has the best statistics? We actually want to hear the why behind your statistics. Why are you where you are? How are you thinking about it? What are you working on? And so on. And without naming names, sorry, that's our rice maker. Makes a very happy song when it's done. We're still in the final stages of the pandemic with these moments in public. There was a very well-known bank that I will not name, but that one would think like, gosh, they would probably be one of the top contenders, and they lost the opportunity to take Stitch Fix to IPO. Again, not because I don't think they had particularly worse representation statistics than any other bank that pitched, but the way that they showed up on it was like, first they kind of submitted statistics that were kind of obfuscating, like kind of trying to hide it a little bit, and then we called them on it and said like, what is this? Like, you need to represent it in this way, like this is so on. And then they kind of tried to talk it away, and we sort of said, you know what, we think there's a values issue here, because we were really clear with you about what matters. We're really clear with you again that like this is an opportunity for dialogue. It's not going to be a deal breaker thing per se, and you're not showing up in good faith. And if you're not showing up in good faith on this, like, why do we think you're going to show up in good faith on like the broader work together?
Wow, yo, snaps. Okay, for that, because people definitely tend to turn a blind eye, if you would, when it comes down to like the big money, right? They'll turn a blind eye for the sake of the dollar. So the fact that Stitch Fix like really held to it, like that is just amazing, like to hear. And side note, when your rice maker was going off, I was thinking in my head, I'm going to get those kids because I told them to be quiet, and I hear somebody's toy. So when you said, did you save the kids? Because I was going to get them after we were done. So thank you for letting me know that was the rice maker. But I know we are pretty much wrapped up on time. I told you it flies by. But Jevan, before we go, and thank you so much again for your insights. I was taking notes, and I really hope that our audience was able to take notes, and I hope that they continue to follow you, because I feel like you have so much more to give, so much experience to share that I can learn from and that so many others can learn from. So before we kind of sign off, I would love for you to take a moment and just let folks know where they can find you, how they can stay in contact with you or stay up to date with what you have going on.
Yeah, you can find me on, well, I don't really tweet. Unfortunately, this is always an awkward question because I'm not, probably not the most prolific social media participant, but I am on Twitter, Jevan Soo at Twitter. I don't tweet a lot, so you can follow me if you want. You're welcome to follow me on LinkedIn. Just as a disclaimer, I don't add people that I haven't interacted with sort of significantly, and so please don't be offended if you add me on LinkedIn and I don't accept, because it'll probably just because we haven't had a major interaction. But you're certainly, LinkedIn lets you follow people as well, so you're certainly welcome to follow me in terms of the things that I might speak out there. And then my Instagram is not my name. It's Platypian, Platypian. It is a public account. It's more of my kind of personal family account. And the funny backstory to that one is my favorite animal is a platypus. And the reason why is, for those of you who don't know, platypus is an animal that only lives in Australia. It is a very, very weird animal. It has a duck bill. It kind of looks like an otter with a duck bill, and flipped, sort of webbed feet and so on. And the sort of European explorers that first discovered it thought it was a hoax. Like they thought someone had literally just like stitched together an animal to like punk them, basically. And I sort of love it because I think it's this example of like, the world kind of always wants to put you in a box, right? Like the way that the human brain is you want to classify things. It makes it simpler and easier for everyone, which, for some things is good, for humans is bad, I think. And the platypus is an example of saying like, you can't put me in a box. Like I can be any combination of things that I want to be. Like it's just, whatever sort of speaks to you, that is what a platypus is. And so Platypian is my making the platypus word into an adjective.
I love it. I love it. That is so cool. Thank you so much for that and for your time today. Wow, I wish I had more time with you. I'm definitely going to sync with you on LinkedIn because I had a conversation with you.
You did have a conversation with me.
I'm hoping I get accepted. But like he said, you can always follow folks on LinkedIn. That follow button works. And if you are so inclined maybe to want to reach out to him in any capacity, you can always put a note, a personalized note in your invite. So maybe sharing like, hey, I heard you on the Power to Fly Summit and I wanted to talk to you more about X, Y, and Z, and see if that can maybe, spark some additional dialogue and conversation for those of you that want to reach out to Jevan. Otherwise, thank you again. I'm gonna pass it over to Meg. This was so great. Thank you so much, Jevan.
Thank you so much, Deanna. It was a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you both so much. That was absolutely wonderful. I absolutely loved getting to listen in on that conversation. So thank you to you both.